his vow, her prison. Livia Marchesi had once been royalty in their world, until the night her father was betrayed and his empire fell, leaving her with nothing but a name that now meant death. She had spent a year in hiding, and now he had found her. Rafael Costa smirked, shaking his head. "You thought you could survive without me?" he murmured. "Let's see how well you beg." Chapter 1. The Ghost of Marchesi Manor. The dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the boarded-up windows of Marchesi Manor. Livia traced the intricate carvings on the massive oak dining table, the wood cold and smooth beneath her fingertips. It had been a year since she'd last stood in this room, a year since the scent of her father's favorite lemon and basil pasta had filled the air, a year since laughter had echoed off these now silent walls. Now, only the ghosts remained. She could almost see them. Her father, Don Alessandro Marchesi, a giant of a man with a booming laugh and eyes that could freeze hell over, sitting at the head of the table. Her mother, Isabella, elegant and serene, her hand always resting gently on her husband's arm, and her brother, Marco, perpetually teasing, his grin as bright as the Amalfi sun. All gone. Betrayed. Murdered. Livia wrapped her arms around herself, the chill of the abandoned manor seeping into her bones. She was a ghost herself, a shadow flitting through the ruins of her past. The once vibrant silk dress she wore, now faded and worn, was a stark reminder of the life she'd lost. Her once meticulously styled dark hair now hung limp and lifeless, framing a face that had become gaunt, the high cheekbones more pronounced, the large, brown eyes haunted by sleepless nights and the constant gnawing fear of discovery. She'd traded her diamond earrings for simple silver hoops, her designer heels for practical, worn boots. The only remnant of her former life was the Marchesi signet ring, a heavy gold band with a snarling panther engraved on its surface, hidden beneath a plain leather glove. It was a dangerous reminder, a symbol of a lineage that was now a death sentence. The air in the manor was thick with the scent of decay and old memories. Livia walked through the once grand ballroom, the parquet floor now cracked and warped. She could almost hear the music, see the swirling gowns, feel the warmth of her father's hand on her back as he guided her through a waltz. A sob caught in her throat. She pressed her hand against the cold, damp wall, trying to steady herself. She had meticulously planned her escape, trading favors, calling in old debts owed to her father, disappearing into the anonymity of the sprawling city. She had found refuge in a small, sparsely furnished apartment above a bustling bakery in a neighborhood far removed from the opulent world she once knew. She worked as a seamstress, her nimble fingers, once accustomed to handling jewels, now adept at mending tears and altering hems. It was a quiet life, a lonely life, but it was safe. Or so she had thought. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Livia froze, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She hadn't locked the back entrance. Foolish. Careless. The years of living in pampered luxury had dulled her instincts. She slowly backed away, her eyes fixed on the shadowed doorway leading to the grand staircase. Silence. Then, another creak, closer this time. Livia reached into the pocket of her worn dress, her fingers closing around the small, pearl-handled pistol she had managed to salvage from the wreckage of her former life. It was a lady's gun, more for show than serious defense, but it was all she had. The shadows shifted, and a figure emerged from the darkness. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a stance that radiated power and control. Even in the dim light, Livia recognized him. Raffaele Costa. Her father's right-hand man, the one man her father had trusted implicitly, and the one man Livia had always secretly feared. His face was a study in contrasts, sharp, angular features, a strong jawline shadowed by dark stubble, and eyes that were the color of glacial ice. He was dressed impeccably, as always, in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light, a stark contrast to the faded grandeur of the manor. He moved with a predatory grace, like a panther stalking its prey. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her disheveled appearance, the worn dress, the haunted eyes. A slow, cruel smile curved his lips. Livia, he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent shivers down her spine. You look thinner. Livia raised the pistol, her hand trembling slightly. Stay back, Raphael. He chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. And what will you do with that, Principessa? Shoot me? You wouldn't even know how to hold it properly. He took a step closer. Livia tightened her grip on the gun, her finger hovering over the trigger. She remembered the way he used to look at her, a mixture of amusement and something darker, something that made her skin crawl. My father trusted you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Your father was a fool, Raphael replied, his voice cold and hard. A sentimental old fool who believed in loyalty and honor. Those are luxuries we can no longer afford. And Marco? Isabella? Livia's voice cracked. Did you? His smile widened. They were collateral damage. Necessary sacrifices. Livia felt a surge of rage, hot and blinding. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to make him pay for what he had done. But she knew she was no match for him. He was a killer, a seasoned predator, and she was just a frightened girl playing at being brave. He took another step, closing the distance between them. The scent of his cologne, a blend of Old Spice and something darker, more dangerous, filled her nostrils. It was the scent of power, the scent of death. I've been looking for you, Livia, he said, his voice soft, almost a caress. For a long time. Why? She asked, her voice trembling. To finish what you started? He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. His touch, surprisingly gentle, sent a jolt of electricity through her. She flinched, but she didn't pull away. No, he said, his eyes locking with hers. To protect you. Livia stared at him, her mind reeling. Protect her? After everything he had done? It was a lie, a cruel joke. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that looked almost like sincerity. He moved closer, and with all the air sucked from her chest, she did nothing but stand there, a ghost in a mausoleum, staring up at the one man who could be her salvation, or her final executioner. The gun slipped a bit in her grip. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Empty Throne. Raphael's hand lingered on her hair for a moment longer, the ghost of a touch sending a shiver through Livia despite her fear. He then lowered his hand, his eyes still locked on hers. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city and the frantic beating of Livia's own heart. Protect me? Livia finally managed to choke out, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. You slaughtered my family. You destroyed everything. Raphael's expression didn't change, his glacial eyes unwavering. Your father made enemies, Livia. Powerful enemies. He clung to old ways, old codes. He refused to adapt. He sealed his own fate, and the fate of those closest to him. And you adapted? Livia spat, the word laced with venom. You betrayed him. You sided with those animals. A flicker of something pain? Regret? Crossed Raphael's face, but it was gone so quickly Livia wondered if she'd imagined it. I did what I had to do to survive. To protect what was left. What was left? There's nothing left. You took it all. Her voice rose, echoing through the empty hall. The small pistol felt heavy and useless in her hand. Raphael stepped closer, invading her personal space. He was so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the subtle, dangerous scent of him that both repelled and, strangely, intrigued her. There is you, he said, his voice low and husky. The last of the Marchesi line. The heiress to nothing, it's true. But a name still carries weight, Livia. Even a ruined one. Livia stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and anger. She couldn't trust him. She shouldn't trust him. He was a monster, a traitor. And yet there was a strange pull, a magnetic force that drew her to him. It was the same pull she had always felt, the one she had fought against, the one that terrified her. Why are you here, Raphael? She asked, her voice softer now, almost a plea. What do you want? He reached out and gently took the pistol from her hand. She didn't resist. He examined it with a practiced eye, then tucked it into his jacket pocket. I want to offer you a deal, he said, his gaze never leaving hers. My protection, in exchange for your cooperation. Cooperation? Livia laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. What kind of cooperation could you possibly want from me? I have nothing to offer. You have your name, Raphael repeated. Your lineage. And you have me. Livia's breath caught in her throat. The way he said it, the intensity in his eyes, sent a jolt of something other than fear through her. Something dangerous, something forbidden. I don't understand, she whispered. He leaned closer, his lips close to her ear. The families are at war, Livia. The old alliances are crumbling. There's a power vacuum, and everyone is scrambling to fill it. Your father's death, it destabilized everything. And you want to use me, Livia realized, a cold dread settling in her stomach. You want to use my name to gain an advantage. I want to keep you alive, Raphael corrected, his voice firm. And yes, your name can help me. It can help us. We can rebuild, Livia. Together. The idea was preposterous. Rebuild? With the man who had destroyed her life? And yet, a tiny spark of hope flickered within her. The thought of reclaiming even a fraction of what she had lost, of avenging her family, was intoxicating. And if I refuse? She asked, her voice barely audible. His expression hardened. Then you're on your own. And I can't guarantee your safety. The enemies who killed your father, they're still out there. And they know you're alive. Livia shivered. She knew he was right. She had been living on borrowed time, hiding in the shadows. Her luck would run out eventually. What would I have to do? She asked, her voice hesitant. Raphael smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a thrill of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite name, through her. For now, just trust me. Come with me. I have a place prepared for you. A safe place. Trust him. The words echoed in her mind. Could she trust the man who had betrayed her father? Could she trust the man who held her life in his hands? She looked around one last time, at the dusty opulence and the setting sun. She had no other choice. All right, she said, her voice nearly a whisper. I'll go with you. The smallest ghost of a smile flickered on his face. He offered his arm. Chapter 3. A shadow across the sun. Raphael's arm felt surprisingly solid and reassuring beneath Livia's hesitant touch. It was a stark contrast to the crumbling world around them, a tangible anchor in a sea of uncertainty. As they walked out of the Marchesi Manor, leaving the ghosts and the dust behind, Livia couldn't help but steal glances at him. He moved with a quiet confidence, his head held high, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. He was a man who was used to being in control, a man who was accustomed to danger. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown gardens, painting the scene in shades of gold and amber. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves and the faint, lingering fragrance of the roses that had once bloomed in profusion along the crumbling stone walls. Livia remembered running through these gardens as a child, her laughter echoing through the air. Now, only silence reigned. A sleek, black car was parked discreetly at the end of the long, winding driveway, its engine idling softly. A driver, a burly man with a scarred face and cold, watchful eyes, stood beside it, his hand resting casually inside his jacket, likely on a weapon. He nodded curtly to Raphael, but his gaze lingered on Livia, assessing, calculating. She felt a chill run down her spine. Raphael opened the back door for her, his hand hovering protectively near her back. She slid into the plush leather seat, the scent of expensive leather and aftershave filling her nostrils. It was a world away from the cramped, dusty apartment she had called home for the past year. Raphael got in beside her, the car instantly feeling smaller, more intimate. The driver closed the door with a solid thud, sealing them inside. As the car pulled away, Livia looked back at the manor, its silhouette growing smaller and smaller against the fiery sunset. It looked like a tomb, a monument to a lost world. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, refusing to show any weakness in front of Raphael. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Raphael turned to her, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the car. To a safe house. A place where you'll be protected. Protected from whom? Livia pressed. Your new allies? He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. From everyone, he finally said, his voice low. There are many who would want to see the Marquesi line extinguished completely. You're a threat, Livia, simply by existing. Livia shivered. She had known this, of course, but hearing it from Raphael, from the man who had been so close to her father, made it all the more real. And what about you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Are you a threat to me? He turned to her, his ice-blue eyes piercing through the darkness. I could have killed you back there, Livia, he said, his voice soft, almost a caress. If I wanted you dead, you would be. The truth of his words hung heavy in the air. He could have. He had the power, the opportunity. And yet he hadn't. Why didn't you? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers surprisingly warm against her skin. Because I made a promise, he said, his voice husky. A promise to your father. Livia stared at him, her heart pounding. What promise? He withdrew his hand, his expression turning guarded once more. To keep you safe. To protect the Marquesi legacy, even if it meant going against his wishes. Livia didn't know what to believe. She wanted to trust him, to believe that he was telling the truth. But the memory of her father's lifeless body, the image of her brother's shattered face, kept flashing before her eyes. The car sped through the city streets, the lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of color. Livia watched the world go by, feeling a strange sense of detachment. She was caught between two worlds, the shattered remnants of her past and the uncertain, dangerous future that Raphael was offering her. They eventually arrived at a nondescript building in a quiet, residential neighborhood. It looked ordinary, unassuming, blending seamlessly with the other houses on the street. But Livia knew better. She could sense the layers of security, the hidden defenses. The driver parked the car in an underground garage, the heavy steel door closing behind them with a resounding clang. Raphael got out and opened the door for her, his hand once again hovering protectively near her back. Welcome, he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, to your new home. The home was, to say the least, shocking. It was not the cold, steel fortress she had imagined. The furnishings whispered of understated wealth, of curated antiques and silk throws. But it was a cage, nonetheless. A beautiful one, perhaps, but a cage all the same. And as Raphael closed the door behind them, with its multiple, heavy locks, Livia knew her real trial had just begun. She turned and faced him. Chapter 4. The scent of betrayal and old spice. The heavy door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of the lavishly appointed apartment. Livia turned to face Raphael, her back to the door as if she could somehow escape if she needed to. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the opulent surroundings doing little to ease the knot of fear in her stomach. The scent of old spice, now inextricably linked with Raphael, mingled with the subtle fragrance of lilies that emanated from a large vase on a nearby table. It was a jarring combination, the familiar comfort of the cologne clashing with the underlying current of danger he represented. This is quite a change from the manner, Livia said, her voice laced with a forced lightness she didn't feel. She gestured around the room, taking in the plush velvet sofas, the gleaming mahogany furniture, the intricate Persian rugs. It was a world she had once belonged to, but now felt utterly alien. Raphael leaned against a nearby wall, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. It's necessary, he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. You need to be protected. And you need to be comfortable. Comfortable? Livia laughed, a short, brittle sound. Is that what you call this? Imprisonment in a gilded cage? His eyes narrowed slightly. It's not imprisonment, Livia. It's protection. Until things settle down, you need to stay hidden. And this is the safest place for you. Safe with you? Livia challenged, her voice rising. The man who betrayed my father? The man who helped murder my family? The muscles in his jaw tightened. I've told you. I did what I had to do. Your father was a liability. He refused to see the changing landscape. So you killed him? Livia's voice was trembling now, tears welling up in her eyes. You just killed him? Raphael pushed himself off the wall and took a step towards her. I didn't pull the trigger, Livia, he said, his voice low and intense. But I didn't stop it either. I made a choice, and I'll live with the consequences. The honesty in his voice, the raw pain in his eyes, surprised her. It didn't excuse his actions, but it humanized him, making him something more than just a monster. And Marco? Isabella? Livia whispered, the names catching in her throat. Did you have to make a choice about them, too? He closed his eyes for a moment, his face etched with a pain that mirrored her own. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, he said, his voice barely audible. There was nothing I could do. Livia wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that there was some shred of decency left in him, some remorse for the devastation he had caused. But the doubt lingered, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Why should I trust you, Raphael? She asked, her voice shaking. Give me one reason. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. She flinched, but she didn't pull away. Because I'm the only one who can keep you alive, he said, his voice husky. And because I care about you, Livia. More than you know. His words, the intensity in his eyes, sent a shiver down her spine. It was a dangerous admission, a forbidden desire that had no place in their shattered world. Livia stared at him, her mind reeling. She was drawn to him, repelled by him, terrified of him, and yet there was a strange, undeniable connection between them. A connection forged in shared loss, in shared danger, in the ashes of a destroyed empire. She began, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say, what to do. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. Don't fight it, Livia, he whispered. Don't fight us. The scent of Old Spice and betrayal enveloped her, a suffocating embrace. She closed her eyes, her body trembling. She was trapped, caught between her fear and a desire she couldn't deny. A desire for the man who held her life in his hands, the man who was both her protector and her captor. He drew back slightly, and with a soft, almost questioning pressure, brushed his thumb across her bottom lip. She looked at him with an uncertainty that mirrored the conflict tearing her apart. He waited. The decision, the next move, was hers. And that knowledge, that power, no matter how small, gave her the courage to make a choice. She leaned in. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Marketplace. The kiss was tentative at first, a hesitant exploration of forbidden territory. Livia's lips trembled beneath Raphael's, her body stiff with apprehension. But as he deepened the kiss, a slow, burning heat began to spread through her, melting the ice that had encased her heart. She responded, tentatively at first, then with a growing urgency, her arms wrapping around his neck, her fingers tangling in his thick, dark hair. It was a kiss born of desperation, of loneliness, of a shared grief that transcended the boundaries of betrayal and mistrust. It was a kiss that acknowledged the darkness between them, the blood that stained their hands, and yet, somehow, found a spark of hope, a flicker of desire in the ruins. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, their eyes locked in a gaze that was both questioning and intense. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their shared past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Livia began, but she couldn't find the words. She felt exposed, vulnerable, her emotions raw and untamed. Raphael gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. Don't say anything, he whispered, his voice husky. Not yet. He led her to one of the plush sofas, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Livia felt a strange sense of peace, a temporary reprieve from the fear and uncertainty that had been her constant companions for the past year. I need to get out, she blurted suddenly, surprising herself and judging by the slight raising of his eyebrow, Raphael. He looked at her. Out where? It's not safe.
Not out.
But I need air. I need normalcy. I need to feel something other than this. She waved a hand encompassing the elegant cage, this gilded prison. He studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. He seemed to weigh their quest, the desire in her eyes and its counterpoint in the risk to their security. The marketplace, he said, finally. Early tomorrow. It's crowded, but we can be discreet. You'll need to blend in. Livia nodded, a flicker of excitement sparking within her. The thought of being out in the world, even for a short time, filled her with a sense of anticipation. The next morning, Livia woke to find a simple, but well-made, dress laid out on a chair. It was a far cry from the designer gowns she used to wear, but it was clean and comfortable. She also found a scarf, a pair of sunglasses, and a wide-brimmed hat. Clearly, Raphael had thought of everything. She dressed quickly, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She hadn't been out in public, among ordinary people, for over a year. Raphael was waiting for her in the living room, dressed in a casual shirt and jeans, looking surprisingly less intimidating than usual. He still had that aura of power and control, but it was tempered by a hint of vulnerability. Ready? He asked, his eyes scanning her, taking in her altered appearance. Livia nodded, pulling the hat lower over her eyes. As I'll ever be. They took a different car this time, a smaller, less conspicuous vehicle. The driver was the same, his scarred face still impassive. They drove to a bustling marketplace in a part of the city Livia didn't recognize. The air was filled with the sounds of vendors hawking their wares, the chatter of shoppers, the laughter of children. The smells of fresh produce, spices, and street food mingled in the air. It was a sensory overload, a vibrant tapestry of life that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Raphael kept a close watch on her, his hand never far from her arm, guiding her through the crowded stalls. He bought her a fresh pastry from a street vendor, the sweet, flaky dough melting in her mouth. It was a simple pleasure, but it felt like a luxury. She listened to the hushed conversations, catching phrases, the cadence, a language she knew but suddenly felt separated from. Don't stare so much, he cautioned quietly. It'll draw attention. She nodded, chastened. As they walked, Livia noticed the whispers, the furtive glances. People recognized Raphael, even in his disguise. They stepped aside, their eyes widening with a mixture of fear and respect. She realized that he was a powerful man, even outside of the opulent world of the mafia. He was a force to be reckoned with, a man who commanded both fear and loyalty. And she was with him, walking beside him, a part of his world, whether she liked it or not. The realization sent a shiver of both fear and a strange, unexpected thrill through her. She was playing a dangerous game, walking a tightrope between survival and destruction. And the man beside her, the man who held her life in his hands, was the one who would determine her fate. He stopped, suddenly, his body tensing. He'd heard something she hadn't. His hand tightened around her arm. Chapter 6. The Weight of a Fallen Crown. Raphael's grip on Livia's arm tightened, his body subtly shifting to shield her from the flow of the crowd. His eyes, usually cool and detached, were now narrowed, scanning the marketplace with a focused intensity that sent a jolt of alarm through her. He had heard something, a whisper, a name, a threat she didn't know, but the sudden shift in his demeanor was unmistakable. What is it? Livia whispered, her voice barely audible above the din of the marketplace. He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on a group of men standing near a fruit stall a short distance away. They were dressed casually, but there was something about their stance, their watchful eyes, that set them apart from the other shoppers. Livia recognized the look, the guarded posture of men who were used to violence, men who were accustomed to being obeyed. Costa, one of the men said, his voice low but carrying clearly across the short distance. It wasn't a greeting, but a challenge, an accusation. Raphael's hand moved subtly to the inside of his jacket, likely to the gun Livia knew he carried. He didn't draw it, but the gesture was a clear warning. Gentlemen, Raphael said, his voice calm and even, but with an underlying steeliness that sent shivers down Livia's spine. What a pleasant surprise. The men approached, their movements deliberate, their eyes fixed on Raphael. Livia could feel the tension radiating from him, the coiled energy of a predator ready to strike. "We heard you were back in town," the leader of the group, a man with a cruel scar that bisected his left eyebrow, said, "and that you were keeping company with certain individuals." His gaze flicked to Livia, his eyes lingering on her with a predatory interest that made her skin crawl. She instinctively moved closer to Raphael, seeking the protection of his presence. "My company is my own concern," Raphael said, his voice dangerously low. "Unless you have a specific reason to interfere?" The men chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "The Marchesi girl," the scarred man said. "She's a loose end, a liability, and we were asked to tie up loose ends." Livia felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. She knew this was coming, had anticipated it, but hearing the words spoken aloud, the threat made so explicit, was terrifying. Raphael's hand tightened on her arm, his grip almost painful. "She's under my protection," he said, his voice a low growl. "Touch her, and you'll answer to me." The men exchanged glances, a silent communication that spoke volumes. They were assessing Raphael, weighing their options. They were outnumbered, but they were also clearly confident in their own abilities. "We don't want any trouble, Costa," the scarred man said, his voice deceptively smooth. "But orders are orders. And the girl, she's worth a lot to certain people." "She's worth more to me," Raphael said, his voice unwavering. "Alive." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Livia could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She was trapped in the middle of a power struggle, a pawn in a deadly game. Suddenly, Raphael moved. He pushed Livia behind him, shielding her with his body, and drew his gun in a single, fluid motion. The movement was so fast, so unexpected, that the other men were momentarily caught off guard. "Don't be fools," Raphael said, his voice cold and deadly. "Walk away. Now." The men hesitated, their hands hovering near their own weapons. They were clearly not expecting Raphael to be so bold, so willing to risk a confrontation in the middle of a crowded marketplace. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Livia held her breath, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before her. She was terrified, but also strangely exhilarated. She was witnessing a side of Raphael she had only glimpsed before, the ruthless, dangerous side that had allowed him to survive in the brutal world of the Mafia. Finally, the scarred man gave a curt nod. "This isn't over, Costa," he said, his voice filled with menace. "We'll be seeing you again." He and his men turned and melted back into the crowd, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Raphael slowly lowered his gun, his body still tense, his eyes scanning the marketplace for any further threats. He turned to Livia, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. Livia nodded, her legs trembling. "Yes," she managed to whisper. "But who were they?" "The Salernos," he said, his voice grim. "One of the families vying for control. They're ambitious, ruthless, and they see you as a way to weaken me." He holstered his gun. His hand, when he reached for hers, was shaking. The weight of everything, the fallen crown she no longer wore, the present danger, all of it seemed to press on them both. "We need to go," he said. Chapter 7. Costa's uninvited arrival. The drive back to the safe house was silent and tense. Livia sat huddled in the corner of the car, her mind racing. The encounter in the marketplace had shattered any illusion of safety she might have had. She was a target, a prize to be fought over, and Raphael was the only thing standing between her and those who wanted her dead. Raphael's face was a mask of grim determination, his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He was clearly shaken by the confrontation, the realization that his enemies were closing in, that his protection of Livia was making him a target as well. When they arrived back at the apartment, Raphael ushered her inside quickly, his hand on the small of her back, his body shielding her from any potential threats. He locked the door behind them, engaging multiple deadbolts with a series of metallic clicks that echoed in the silence. "Stay here," he said, his voice curt. "I need to make some calls." He disappeared into another room, leaving Livia alone in the opulent living room. She paced restlessly, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. She felt trapped, suffocated by the luxurious surroundings, the constant fear gnawing at her. She went to the window, pulling back the heavy drapes slightly to peer out at the street below. It was a normal, quiet residential neighborhood, but Livia knew that danger lurked beneath the surface, that the ordinary facade was just a mask for a world of violence and betrayal. She heard Raphael's voice, raised in anger, coming from the other room. He was speaking in rapid Italian, his words clipped and harsh. She couldn't understand everything he was saying, but she caught snippets of phrases: Salerno's, threat, protection, liability. The conversation went on for a long time, the tension in the air growing thicker with each passing minute. Livia felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition that something was about to change, that her precarious situation was about to become even more dangerous. Finally, Raphael emerged from the room, his face pale and drawn, his eyes dark with worry. He looked at Livia, his expression softening slightly. "I need to go out," he said, his voice strained. "There are things I need to take care of." Livia's heart sank. "Go out? Now? After what happened?" He nodded, his jaw tight. "It's necessary. I need to meet with some people. To try and smooth things over." "Smooth things over?" Livia repeated, her voice incredulous. "With the men who just threatened to kill me?" "It's the only way," Raphael said, his voice firm. "I need to negotiate, to find a solution, to keep you safe." Livia wanted to protest, to beg him not to leave her alone, but she knew it was useless. He had made up his mind. "How long will you be gone?" she asked, her voice trembling. He hesitated, his eyes avoiding hers. "I don't know," he admitted. "A few hours, maybe. Possibly longer." Longer. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. "What if they come back?" Livia asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What if the Salernos?" Raphael reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. "They won't," he said, his voice firm, but with a hint of uncertainty that belied his confidence. "I've taken precautions. The apartment is secure. No one can get in." But Livia began, but he cut her off. "Trust me," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "I'll be back. I promise." It was the same promise he had made to her father, the promise he had broken. And yet, Livia found herself clinging to it, desperate for some reassurance in the face of her growing fear. He kissed her then, a brief, hard kiss that was both a reassurance and a farewell. Then, he was gone, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, leaving Livia alone in the silence of the apartment. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the fading sound of his footsteps, the echo of his promise ringing in her ears. She was alone, completely and utterly alone, with only her fear and the ghosts of her past for company. Hours passed. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room. Livia tried to distract herself, pacing restlessly, flipping through magazines she couldn't focus on, turning the television on and off without watching anything. Then she heard it, a faint scratching sound at the door. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, listening intently. The scratching came again, followed by a soft knock. Someone was at the door. She told herself it was him, returning sooner. But the small, still voice of her instincts screamed otherwise. This was no solid, confident knock. This was something else. Someone else. Chapter 8. Terms of Surrender, and Nothing Less. Livia crept towards the door, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She pressed her ear against the heavy wood, listening intently. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Livia?" A voice called out, muffled by the door. "Livia, it's me, Marco." Livia froze, her blood turning to ice. Marco? Her brother? But that was impossible. Marco was dead. She had seen his body, broken and lifeless. Raphael had told her, Livia, "Open the door," the voice pleaded. "Please, it's really me." Livia's mind raced. Could it be possible? Could Marco have somehow survived? Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered within her. But doubt, cold and hard, quickly followed. It was a trick, a trap. The Salernos, perhaps, using her brother's voice to lure her out. She reached for the peephole, her hand trembling. She peered through the small lens, her breath catching in her throat. It was Marco. He looked different, older, thinner, with a haunted look in his eyes, but it was undeniably him. He was leaning against the doorframe, his face pale and drawn, his clothes rumpled and stained. "Livia, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "I need your help." Livia's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. She wanted to believe. She needed to believe. But the years of ingrained caution, the constant fear of betrayal, held her back. "Marco," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. How is this possible?" "I'll explain everything," he said, his voice urgent. "But please, open the door. It's not safe out here." Livia hesitated. She knew she shouldn't, that it was too risky, that it could be a trap. But the sight of her brother, the desperation in his voice, was too much to resist. She slowly began to undo the locks, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp the metal. The deadbolts clicked open, one by one, the sound echoing in the silence like gunshots. Finally, she pulled the door open, her eyes fixed on Marco's face. He stumbled inside, collapsing into her arms. "Livia," he sobbed, his body shaking. "Thank God you're alive." Livia held him close, her own tears streaming down her face. She couldn't speak, couldn't think, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of the moment. I thought you were dead," she finally managed to whisper. Marco pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "It's a long story," he said, his voice weak. "But I escaped. I've been hiding, trying to find you." "But Raphael," he said. Livia stammered, her mind struggling to reconcile the conflicting realities. Marco's expression hardened. "Raphael?" he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "Don't trust him, Livia. He's the one who..." He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening in alarm. He looked past Livia, towards the open doorway. "We need to go," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." Livia turned to follow his gaze, and her blood ran cold. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the hallway light, were two men. The scarred man from the marketplace, and another, larger man with a cruel smile on his face. The Salernos. Well, the scarred man said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like we have a family reunion." Marco pushed Livia behind him, his body shielding her. "Run, Livia," he shouted. "Get out of here." But it was too late. The larger man stepped forward, blocking their escape. He grabbed Marco roughly, twisting his arm behind his back. "Not so fast," he growled. "We wouldn't want to miss the party." The scarred man approached Livia, his eyes gleaming with predatory interest. "So," he said, his voice smooth and menacing, "the Marchesi heiress. And her brother. This is even better than we hoped." Livia stared at him, her mind numb with terror. She was trapped, caught between the Salernos and the man she thought was dead. And Raphael, the man she had trusted to protect her, was nowhere to be found. The scarred man reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. "Come with us," he said. "We have some unfinished business." Marco struggled against his captor, his face contorted with rage. "Leave her alone," he shouted. "I'll go with you, just leave her out of this." The scarred man laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Oh, we wouldn't dream of leaving her out," he said. "She's the main attraction." He pulled Livia towards the door, his grip tightening on her arm. She looked back at Marco, her eyes filled with terror and despair. He met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a mixture of anger and helplessness. The terms were clear. Her surrender. And nothing less. Chapter 9. The Serpent's Embrace. Livia stumbled alongside the scarred man, his grip a painful vice on her arm. He dragged her down the hallway, away from the relative safety of the apartment, towards an uncertain and terrifying future. Marco's desperate cries echoed behind them, a soundtrack to her growing despair. They reached a stairwell, the scarred man shoving her roughly forward. She stumbled down the steps, her legs shaky and weak, the fear a cold knot in her stomach. The larger man, still holding Marco captive, followed close behind. They reached the underground garage, the same one she and Raphael had used earlier. A different car was waiting, a dark, nondescript sedan with tinted windows. The scarred man shoved Livia into the back seat, the larger man pushing Marco in beside her. The scarred man got into the driver's seat, starting the engine with a roar that echoed in the enclosed space. "Where are you taking us?" Livia asked, her voice trembling. The scarred man chuckled, a cruel, mocking sound. "To meet your new benefactor," he said. "Someone who's very interested in the Marchesi family." Livia's mind raced. Who could it be? Another rival family? Someone even more powerful than the Salernos? The possibilities were endless, each one more terrifying than the last. Marco, slumped beside her, his face pale and drawn, reached out and took her hand. His grip was weak, but it offered a small measure of comfort in the face of the overwhelming fear. "It's going to be all right," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We'll get through this." Livia wanted to believe him, but she couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. She had been betrayed before, by Raphael, by the world she thought she knew. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. The car sped through the city streets, the lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of color. Livia watched the world go by, feeling a strange sense of detachment. She was a prisoner, being transported to an unknown destination, her fate in the hands of men who had no regard for her life. They eventually arrived at a large, imposing building on the outskirts of the city. It looked like an old factory, abandoned and derelict, its windows boarded up, its walls covered in graffiti. It was a far cry from the opulent world she had once known, a stark reminder of how far she had fallen. The scarred man parked the car in a dark, secluded alleyway behind the building. He got out and opened the back door, dragging Livia out roughly. The larger man followed, pushing Marco ahead of him. They were led inside the building, through a maze of dark, dusty corridors. The air was thick with the smell of decay and mildew, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional scuttling of rats. Finally, they reached a large, open room, dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room was empty except for a few chairs and a table in the center. And standing beside the table, his back to them, was a figure shrouded in shadow. "We have them," the scarred man said, his voice deferential. The figure turned slowly, revealing himself. Livia gasped, her blood running cold. It was Don Antonio Salieri, the head of the Salieri family, the man who had ordered her father's death, the man who was Raphael's sworn enemy. He was an older man, with a cruel, weathered face and eyes that were as cold and hard as granite. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, a stark contrast to the grimy surroundings. He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent shivers down Livia's spine. "Welcome, Livia," he said, his voice smooth and menacing. "And Marco. What a surprise. We thought you were unavailable." Marco glared at him, his jaw tight. "You won't get away with this, Salieri," he said, his voice filled with defiance. Salieri chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh, I think I will," he said. "You see, I have plans for you both. Plans that will benefit the Salieri family greatly." He turned his gaze to Livia, his eyes lingering on her with a possessive interest that made her skin crawl. "You, my dear," he said, his voice soft, almost a caress, "are going to be my guest. Until your friend Raphael Costo agrees to my terms." It was like being embraced by a snake, a serpent offering her up as bait. She looked over at Marco, his eyes mirroring the trap they were both in. Chapter 10. Masks of Civility, Hearts of Stone. Salieri's guest accommodations were, unsurprisingly, a far cry from the gilded cage Raphael had provided. Instead of plush sofas and silk drapes, Livia found herself in a small, bare room with a single cot, a rickety chair, and a grimy window that offered a view of a brick wall. The air was cold and damp, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of the city and the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe. Marco was kept in a separate room, down the hall. Livia had only caught a glimpse of him as they were being led to their respective cells, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. The image haunted her, fueling her anxiety and her determination to find a way out. Salieri had made his intentions clear. Livia was a bargaining chip, a pawn in his power struggle with Raphael. He would use her to force Raphael's hand, to extract concessions, to ultimately crush his rival. The thought of being used in such a way, of being a helpless victim in their brutal game, filled her with rage and a desperate need to fight back. The first few hours were a blur of fear and uncertainty. Livia paced restlessly, her mind racing, trying to find a way out, a flaw in their security, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. But the room was bare, the door was locked, and the guards outside were vigilant. She tried to remember everything Raphael had taught her, the subtle art of observation, the importance of finding weaknesses, the need to exploit any advantage, no matter how small. She examined the room meticulously, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon, a tool, a means of escape. But there was nothing. As the hours passed, hunger and thirst began to gnaw at her. She had not eaten or drunk anything since the marketplace, and the stress and fear were taking their toll. She sat on the cot, her head in her hands, trying to conserve her energy, to focus her thoughts. Finally, there was a knock on the door. Livia's heart leaped into her throat. She stood up, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the door. It was not Salieri, but the scarred man, the one who had abducted them. He was carrying a tray with a bowl of thin soup and a glass of water. "Eat," he said, his voice gruff. He placed the tray on the chair, his eyes avoiding Livia's. Livia hesitated. She was starving, but she was also wary. The food could be drugged, poisoned. But she knew she needed to keep up her strength if she was going to have any chance of escaping. She took a tentative sip of the soup. It was bland and watery, but it was warm and filling. She ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, her mind racing. "Where's Marco?" she asked, her voice low. The scarred man didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Is he all right?" Livia pressed. The scarred man finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something in his expression, a hint of sympathy. "He's alive," he said, his voice curt. "That's all you need to know." He turned to leave, but Livia stopped him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Why are you working for Salieri?" The scarred man hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. He looked back at Livia, his expression unreadable. "It's a living," he said, his voice flat. "We all have to make choices." He opened the door and stepped out, closing it behind him with a solid thud. Livia was left alone once again, the silence broken only by the sound of the key turning in the lock. His words echoed in her mind. "We all have to make choices." She was beginning to discover how slim those choices truly were. She had to be smart. She had to be strategic. She had to be patient. But above all, she had to survive. She was a Marchese, and even fallen, broken, the blood in her veins was the blood of fighters. That evening Salieri had her brought to his office. A grotesque parody of her father's. He sat behind an ornate desk, a mockery of civility on his face. "You will write a letter to Costa," he stated. "And say what?" she asked, although she knew. "Tell him you are well, and that he must come alone to meet my demands if he ever wants to see you alive again." Livia stared at the pen he slid across the polished surface. She would write it, but she would also write more than he asked for. Chapter 11. Beneath the velvet gloves. The pen felt heavy in Livia's hand, a cold, unforgiving weight. The blank sheet of paper before her seemed to mock her predicament, a stark white canvas upon which she was expected to paint a picture of submission, of desperation. Salieri watched her, his eyes like chips of ice, his expression a mask of cruel amusement. Don't take all day, Principessa, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Costa is a busy man, and your time is limited. Livia took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She needed to be calm, to be strategic. She needed to use this opportunity, however small, to her advantage. She began to write, her hand trembling slightly at first, then growing steadier as she focused on her task. She wrote the words Salieri had dictated, the carefully crafted message of a damsel in distress, a plea for rescue. She described her surroundings, subtly hinting at the location of the abandoned factory, the layout of the room, the number of guards she had seen. But she also wrote more. She wrote between the lines, weaving a hidden message into the seemingly innocent words, a coded plea for help that only Raphael, with his intimate knowledge of her and her family history, would understand. She used phrases that had special meaning to them, references to childhood memories, to shared secrets, to the language of flowers her mother had taught her. She wrote of the roses that were wilting, a reference to the Marchesi family, their fading power. She wrote of the cold wind that was blowing, a signal of danger, of impending doom. She wrote of the shadows that were lengthening, a plea for him to act quickly, before it was too late. It was a risky gamble, a desperate attempt to communicate with Raphael without alerting Salieri to her deception. If he understood her message, if he could decipher the hidden code, he might have a chance to rescue her. If not, she finished the letter, her hand aching, her heart pounding. She reread it, carefully scrutinizing each word, each phrase, making sure the hidden message was subtle enough to escape Salieri's notice, but clear enough for Raphael to understand. She folded the paper, her hands trembling. She handed it to Salieri, her eyes meeting his. "Will this do?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. Salieri took the letter, his eyes scanning the words quickly. He seemed satisfied, a cruel smile playing on his lips.
"Excellent," he said.
"You're learning, Principessa. You're learning to be cooperative." He sealed the letter in an envelope, addressing it to Raphael. He handed it to the scarred man, who had been standing silently in the corner of the room. "Deliver this to Costa," he ordered, "and tell him time is running out." The scarred man nodded and left the room, the letter clutched in his hand. Livia watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and dread. Her fate now rested in Raphael's hands, in his ability to understand her message, to outwit Salieri, to rescue her from the serpent's embrace. Back in her cell, she went over her message again and again. Had she been clear? Too obvious? She had also subtly scratched a small M in a corner of the desk when Salieri had been distracted.
Marco.
She hoped whoever found it would understand. The waiting was the hardest part. The hours stretched into an eternity, each one filled with agonizing uncertainty. Livia paced restlessly, her mind replaying every possible scenario, every potential outcome. She imagined Raphael receiving the letter, his eyes scanning the words, his mind deciphering the hidden message. She imagined him gathering his men, formulating a plan, preparing to strike. Or she imagined him dismissing the letter as a hoax, a trap set by Salieri. She imagined him refusing to negotiate, sacrificing her life for the sake of his own pride, his own ambition. The doubt gnawed at her, a cold, insidious fear that threatened to consume her. She had trusted Raphael once, and he had betrayed her. Could she trust him now? Did he truly care about her, or was she just a pawn in his game, a means to an end? She clung to the memory of his kiss, the intensity in his eyes, the promise he had made to protect her. She clung to the hope, however fragile, that he would come for her, that he would not abandon her to her fate. Beneath the velvet gloves, she had glimpsed a flicker. She had to trust that flicker. Outside, the first hint of dawn showed itself, and she realized she was holding her breath. Chapter 12. A dance on the razor's edge. The first rays of dawn filtered through the grimy window, casting a pale, weak light across the bare cell. Livia hadn't slept, her mind too restless, her body too tense with anticipation and dread. She had spent the night pacing, praying, replaying every possible scenario in her mind, clinging to the fragile hope that Raphael would come. The waiting was agonizing, a slow, excruciating torture. Every sound, every creak of the building, every distant shout sent her heart racing, her senses on high alert. She listened for the sounds of a rescue, the sounds of gunfire, the sounds of chaos. But there was only silence. As the morning wore on, Livia's hope began to dwindle. Doubt crept in, whispering insidious lies in her ear. He wasn't coming. He had abandoned her. She was alone, trapped, forgotten. She sank onto the cot, her body slumping with exhaustion and despair. She closed her eyes, tears welling up, tracing a path down her cheeks. She had been so foolish to trust him, to believe in his promises. She had been a pawn in his game all along, a tool to be used and discarded. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a faint scraping sound coming from the hallway. Her heart leaped into her throat. She held her breath, listening intently. The scraping came again, closer this time. Then a soft knock on the door. Livia's eyes flew open. She scrambled to her feet, her body trembling. "Livia?" A voice whispered, muffled by the door. It wasn't Raphael's voice. It was Marco's. Livia's mind raced. How had he escaped? Was it a trick? A trap set by Salieri?
Marco?
She whispered back, her voice hesitant. "Is that really you?" "Yes," he replied, his voice urgent. "Open the door."
Quickly.
Livia hesitated. She knew she shouldn't, that it was too risky. But the desperation in Marco's voice, the hope that flickered within her, was too much to resist. She crept towards the door, her hand reaching for the lock. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had to be brave, to be strong. She had to take a chance. She unlocked the door and pulled it open, her eyes widening in surprise. Marco was standing there, his face bruised and battered, his clothes torn, but his eyes filled with a fierce determination. And beside him, his hand resting reassuringly on Marco's shoulder, was Raphael. Livia gasped, her breath catching in her throat. Relief washed over her, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. He had come. He had actually come. "Raphael," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He stepped forward, his eyes searching hers, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Livia nodded, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the sheer joy of seeing him, of knowing that she was safe. "We need to go," Marco said, his voice urgent. "Salieri's men are everywhere." Raphael nodded, his gaze never leaving Livia's. "We're getting out of here," he said, his voice firm. "Both of you." He turned to Marco, his expression hardening. "How did you escape?" Marco explained quickly, his words clipped and concise. He had managed to overpower his guard, using a piece of broken chair leg as a weapon. He had then found Raphael, guided by the subtle clues Livia had left in her letter, and the small M scratched on the desk. Raphael listened intently, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He was formulating a plan, assessing the risks, calculating their chances. He was a warrior, a strategist, a leader. And in that moment, Livia saw him not as a betrayer, not as a captor, but as a savior. "We'll go out the back," Raphael said, his voice decisive. "There's less security there. But we need to be quiet, to be fast. Any questions?" They both shook their heads. They were ready. They were a team, united by a shared goal, a shared determination to survive. It was a dance, a delicate, dangerous dance on the razor's edge of life and death. And as they crept through the darkened corridors, every sense on high alert, Livia knew that one wrong step could be their last. The sound of distant shouting indicated they had been discovered. Chapter 13. The Price of Protection, the Cost of Love. The shouts grew closer, echoing through the labyrinthine corridors of the abandoned factory. Raphael pushed Livia and Marco forward, urging them to move faster, his body shielding them from any potential threats. He held his gun in a ready position, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, his senses on high alert. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice tense. "And don't make a sound." They crept through the darkness, their footsteps barely making a sound on the dusty concrete floor. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, the silence broken only by the frantic beating of their hearts and the distant shouts of Salieri's men. They reached a back door, heavily bolted and padlocked. Raphael quickly assessed the situation, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He pulled out a small set of lockpicks from his pocket, his fingers working deftly and efficiently. "Marco, keep watch," he ordered, his voice low. "Let me know if you see anyone." Marco nodded, his eyes darting nervously around the corridor. He held the piece of broken chair leg he had used to escape, his grip tight, his body tense. Livia watched Raphael work, her heart pounding in her chest. She marveled at his skill, his calmness under pressure, his ability to remain focused in the face of danger. He was a man of many talents, a man who had been trained to survive in a world of violence and betrayal. The lock clicked open with a soft snap. Raphael quickly unbolted the door, pushing it open just enough to allow them to slip through. "Go, go, go," he urged, his voice urgent. They emerged into a narrow alleyway, the fresh air a welcome relief after the stifling atmosphere of the factory. The early morning light was just beginning to illuminate the sky, casting long shadows across the grimy brick walls. "This way," Raphael said, leading them down the alleyway towards a waiting car. It was the same nondescript sedan they had used before, the driver the scarred man standing beside it, his face a mixture of surprise and apprehension.
"What?"
The scarred man began, but Raphael cut him off. "Drive," Raphael ordered, his voice cold and commanding.
"Now."
The scarred man hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering between Raphael and the approaching sounds of Salieri's men. He seemed to weigh his options, the loyalty to his former employer against the very real threat of Raphael's gun. Finally, he nodded, his expression resigned. He opened the back door for Livia and Marco, then got into the driver's seat. Raphael got in beside him, his gun still drawn, his eyes fixed on the alleyway entrance. The car sped away, leaving the abandoned factory behind. Livia looked back, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. They had escaped, but they were still in danger. Salieri would not give up easily. "Where are we going?" Livia asked, her voice trembling. "Somewhere safe," Raphael replied, his voice grim. "Somewhere Salieri won't find you." Marco, slumped beside her, reached out and took her hand. His grip was weak, but it offered a small measure of comfort. "Thank you," Livia whispered to Raphael, her eyes meeting his. "For saving us." He nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I promised I would protect you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. But protection, Livia was beginning to understand, came at a price. And the price, in this world, was often measured in blood, in betrayal, in lost innocence. As they drove further away, the realization dawned on them all. The scarred man.
He was a Salieri man.
He had been the driver. Why had Raphael trusted him? Raphael turned, his eyes meeting Livia's, then Marco's. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. The car swerved. Chapter 14. Cracks in the foundation. The car swerved violently, throwing Livia and Marco against the sides of the vehicle. Tires screeched, the smell of burning rubber filling the air. Raphael struggled with the scarred man, their hands locked on the steering wheel, fighting for control. "What are you doing?" Livia screamed, her voice filled with terror. The scarred man snarled, his face contorted with rage. "You think you can just walk away, Costa?" he shouted. "Salieri owns you. He owns all of us." Raphael, his face grim with determination, managed to wrench the steering wheel back, narrowly avoiding a collision with a parked car. The car spun out of control, careening down the street, before finally slamming into a lamppost with a sickening crunch. The impact threw Livia forward, her head hitting the back of the seat. She felt a sharp pain, then darkness. When she came to, she was disoriented, her head throbbing, her body aching. She could hear Marco groaning beside her, his voice weak. She reached out, her hand finding his, squeezing it reassuringly.
Marco?
She whispered, her voice hoarse. Are you all right? I think so, he replied, his voice strained. What happened? Livia tried to sit up, her head swimming. She looked towards the front of the car. Raphael and the scarred man were slumped over the steering wheel, both unconscious. The car was a wreck, the front end crumpled, the windshield shattered. We crashed, Livia said, her voice trembling. The driver, he tried as she couldn't finish the sentence. The memory of the struggle, the fear, the impact, too overwhelming. She tried to open the car door, but it was jammed shut. She pushed against it with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to rise within her. They were trapped. Marco, help me, she pleaded, her voice desperate. Marco, despite his injuries, managed to pull himself up. Together, they pushed against the door, their combined strength finally forcing it open with a screech of metal. They stumbled out of the car, their legs shaky and weak. The street was deserted, the early morning silence broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing and the distant wail of sirens. Livia looked around, her mind racing. They needed to get away, to find somewhere safe. Salieri's men would be looking for them, and the police would be arriving soon. We need to go, she said, her voice urgent.
Now.
Marco nodded, his face pale and drawn. He was leaning heavily on Livia, his arm injured. They began to walk, slowly at first, then faster, as their adrenaline kicked in. They headed away from the main street, towards the maze of narrow alleyways and back streets that made up this part of the city. As they walked, Livia's mind replayed the events of the past few hours. The escape from the factory, Raphael's rescue, the scarred man's betrayal. It was all too much, too fast, too confusing. She had trusted Raphael, believed in his promise to protect her. But his actions, his decision to trust the scarred man, had nearly cost them their lives.
Why?
What was his plan? Was he truly on their side, or was he playing some deeper, more dangerous game? The foundation of her trust, already weakened by his past betrayals, was now crumbling.
She didn't know who to believe, who to trust.
She was alone, vulnerable, caught in a web of lies and deceit. They reached a small, deserted park, hidden between buildings. They collapsed onto a bench, their bodies exhausted, their minds reeling. We need to figure out what to do, Livia said, her voice trembling. We can't just keep running. Marco nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. We need to find somewhere safe, he said. Somewhere Salieri won't find us. And somewhere Raphael couldn't betray them, Livia added silently. The sirens were getting closer. They had to move.
But where?
And how could they possibly escape the intricate web that had been spun around them? The cracks were showing, and Livia wasn't sure if anything or anyone could be trusted again. She looked at her brother, his familiar face now lined with a worry that mirrored her own. At least they had each other.
For now.
Chapter 15. The Unveiling of Past Sins. They found refuge in a derelict building, a former tenement house slated for demolition. It was a grim, depressing place, with boarded-up windows, crumbling walls, and the lingering smell of decay. But it was hidden, secluded, and offered a temporary respite from the relentless pursuit of Salieri and, potentially, Raphael. Livia and Marco huddled together in a small, dusty room on the top floor, their bodies aching, their minds numb with exhaustion and fear. They had managed to find some old blankets and newspapers, creating a makeshift bed on the floor. Marco's arm was injured, a deep gash that was bleeding profusely. Livia had torn strips of fabric from her dress, creating a makeshift bandage. She had cleaned the wound as best she could, but she knew it needed proper medical attention. We need to find a doctor, she said, her voice worried. Marco shook his head, his face pale and drawn. No, he said, his voice weak. It's too risky. Salieri's men will be everywhere. Hospitals, clinics, they'll be watching. Livia knew he was right. They were trapped, caught between the need for medical care and the constant threat of capture. As the day wore on, the silence between them grew heavy, filled with unspoken questions, unspoken fears. Livia couldn't shake the image of Raphael, slumped over the steering wheel, his fate uncertain. She couldn't reconcile the man who had rescued them with the man who had trusted their lives to a known enemy. "Why did he do it, Marco?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why did he trust the scarred man? Marco hesitated, his eyes avoiding hers. He took a deep breath, as if preparing himself for a difficult conversation. "Raphael, he's not who you think he is, Livia," he said, his voice low and strained. "There are things you don't know. Things about our father, about the family, about Raphael's past." Livia stared at him, her heart pounding. She had always sensed a darkness in Raphael, a hidden layer of secrets that he kept carefully guarded. But she had never imagined the depth of those secrets, the extent of his deception. Marco began to speak, his voice hesitant at first, then growing stronger as he recounted the events of the past, the hidden truths that had been kept from Livia for so long. He told her of their father's ruthlessness, his willingness to sacrifice anything, anyone, for the sake of power. He told her of the alliances he had forged, the enemies he had made, the blood that had been spilled. And he told her of Raphael's origins, of his childhood spent in poverty, of his father's death at the hands of a rival family, a family their father had secretly supported. He told her of Raphael's vow of vengeance, his infiltration of the Marchesi family, his slow, patient climb to power, his ultimate betrayal. "He used our father," Marco said, his voice filled with bitterness. "He used all of us. He played the long game, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when he did, he took everything." Livia listened in stunned silence, her mind reeling. The world she thought she knew, the family she had loved, the man she had been drawn to, it was all a lie, a carefully constructed facade built on a foundation of betrayal and deceit. "But why did he save us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did he risk his life for us if he hates us so much?" Marco looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and understanding. "He doesn't hate you, Livia," he said. "He cares for you, in his own twisted way. But his loyalty lies elsewhere, with his own past, with his own vengeance." He explained that the scarred man had been Raphael's contact all along. The plan had been for Raphael to bring Livia, under the guise of protection, closer to the Salieri family for an eventual, devastating blow that would solidify his position. A position earned by betraying the very family Livia had thought to rebuild with him. The unveiling of past sins had ripped away the veil, revealing a truth more horrifying than she could have imagined. And as darkness began to fall, Livia knew that she could never trust Raphael Costa again. Chapter 16. Blood on the Cobblestones. The revelation of Raphael's true nature left Livia reeling, her world shattered into a million fragments of betrayal and deceit. She felt numb, hollow, the pain of his deception a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She had trusted him, had loved him, had believed in his promises. And he had used her, manipulated her, played her for a fool. She looked at Marco, his face pale and drawn in the dim light of the setting sun. He had been a victim too, caught in the crossfire of Raphael's twisted game. They were both alone, vulnerable, hunted by enemies on all sides. "We need to get out of here," Livia said, her voice firm, despite the trembling in her hands. "We can't stay here. It's too dangerous." Marco nodded, his eyes filled with a grim determination. "We need to disappear," he said. "To find somewhere Salieri and Raphael won't find us." They gathered their meager belongings, the few scraps of food they had managed to find, the tattered blankets that offered little warmth. They crept out of the derelict building, their senses on high alert, their bodies tense with anticipation and fear. They walked through the darkened streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares, sticking to the shadows, their footsteps barely making a sound on the cobblestones. The city was a dangerous place, a labyrinth of hidden threats and unseen enemies. They reached a small, deserted piazza, a quiet oasis in the heart of the bustling city. A fountain gurgled softly in the center, the water shimmering in the moonlight. They sat on the edge of the fountain, their bodies exhausted, their minds racing. Where can we go? Livia asked, her voice desperate. We have no money, no friends, no allies. Marco was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the flowing water. He seemed to be lost in thought, weighing their options, calculating their chances. There's one place, he finally said, his voice low. A place our father used to go. A sanctuary, of sorts. It's far from here, in the countryside. But it's safe.
No one knows about it.
Livia looked at him, her heart filled with a flicker of hope. A sanctuary. A place where they could hide, regroup, plan their next move. How do we get there?
She asked.
Marco explained the route, a long and arduous journey by foot and by train. It would be dangerous, risky, but it was their only hope. They set off, their bodies aching, their spirits weary. They walked through the night, the city slowly giving way to the countryside. The air grew fresher, the sounds of traffic fading into the distance. As they walked, Livia couldn't shake the image of Raphael's face, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and deceit. She hated him, she despised him, but she couldn't deny the lingering feelings, the remnants of the love she had felt for him. She had been so blind, so naive. She had allowed herself to be seduced by his charm, his power, his promises. She had fallen for his lies, his carefully crafted facade. Suddenly, they heard a noise. The sound of footsteps, approaching fast. They froze, their hearts pounding. They looked around, searching for a place to hide. Too late. A group of men emerged from the shadows, their faces grim, their hands holding guns. Salieri's men. Well, one of the men said, his voice mocking. Look what we have here. The Marchesi siblings. Out for a stroll? Livia and Marco were surrounded, trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Don Antonio will be pleased, another man said, his voice filled with a cruel satisfaction. He thought you might have slipped through our fingers. Livia stood tall, her head held high, her eyes filled with defiance. She would not cower, she would not beg. She was a Marchesi, and she would face her fate with courage, with dignity. Take us to Salieri, she said, her voice steady. We have nothing to fear from him. The men laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. They grabbed Livia and Marco roughly, their hands bruising their arms. As they were being dragged away, Livia saw a flicker of movement in the shadows. A figure, tall and imposing, stepped into the moonlight. Raphael. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes blazing with a dangerous light. He held a gun in his hand, his stance that of a predator ready to strike. Let them go, he said, his voice low and deadly. The men hesitated, their eyes widening in surprise and fear. They had not expected to encounter Raphael, the man they had been ordered to betray. Acosta, one of the men stammered. What are you doing here? Raphael didn't answer. He raised his gun, his aim steady, his finger on the trigger. The cobblestones were about to be stained with blood. And Livia didn't know whose side he was on. Chapter 17. A desperate gamble for freedom. The tension in the piazza was thick enough to cut with a knife. The moonlight illuminated the scene, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the cobblestones. Raphael stood like a statue carved from ice, his gun trained on Salieri's men, his eyes blazing with a cold fury that sent shivers down Livia's spine. I said, let them go, Raphael repeated, his voice dangerously low, each word a sharp, distinct threat. Salieri's men exchanged nervous glances. They were caught between their orders to capture Livia and Marco and the very real threat of Raphael's wrath. They knew his reputation, his ruthlessness, his skill with a weapon. We have orders, one of the men stammered, his voice trembling slightly. From Don Antonio. Raphael's lips curled into a cruel smile. Don Antonio is no longer in a position to give orders, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. And you are no longer in a position to obey them. He took a step forward, his gun never wavering. The men instinctively backed away, their hands hovering near their own weapons, but they were clearly hesitant to challenge him. What do you want, Costa? Another man asked, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. I want the Marquesses, Raphael said, his voice unwavering. And I want you to walk away.
Now.
The men hesitated, their eyes darting between Raphael and each other. They were weighing their options, calculating their chances. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a man who had nothing to lose. Livia watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to expect, what to believe. Raphael's actions were contradictory, his motives unclear. Was he rescuing them, or was this another elaborate ruse, another twist in his twisted game? Don't be fools, Raphael said, his voice hardening. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed. Just let them go, and you can walk away. The leader of the group, a burly man with a scarred face, seemed to be considering Raphael's offer. He looked at his men, his expression uncertain. Suddenly, one of the younger men, his face pale with fear, broke ranks. He dropped his gun and raised his hands in surrender. I'm out, he said, his voice trembling. I don't want any part of this. The other men followed suit, reluctantly lowering their weapons, their faces a mixture of relief and resignation. They had made their choice. Survival over loyalty. Raphael nodded, his gaze never leaving the scarred man, the leader of the group.
Smart move, he said.
Now get out of here. And tell Salieri he's finished. The men turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. Raphael slowly lowered his gun, his body relaxing slightly, but his eyes still watchful, alert. He turned to Livia and Marco, his expression softening. Are you all right? He asked, his voice rough with concern. Livia stared at him, her mind reeling. She didn't know what to say, what to do. She was grateful for his intervention, for saving them from Salieri's men, but she couldn't forget his betrayal, his deception. Why, Raphael? She finally asked, her voice trembling. Why are you doing this? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions, regret, remorse, and something else, something that looked almost like love. I made a mistake, Livia, he said, his voice low. A terrible mistake. I let my past, my thirst for vengeance, cloud my judgment. I hurt you, I betrayed you, and I can't forgive myself for that. He explained, haltingly, that he had realized the error of his ways, the futility of his quest for revenge. He had seen the pain he had caused, the damage he had done, and he had decided to change course, to protect Livia and Marco, no matter the cost. It was a desperate gamble. A gamble to earn their freedom, to earn back their trust, to earn back some shred of redemption. But Livia knew that trust, once broken, was almost impossible to repair. The scars of his betrayal ran deep, and she didn't know if she could ever truly forgive him, if she could ever truly believe in him again. They were out of immediate danger, yes. But were they free? Or merely pawns in another game? She looked over at Marco, his face etched with exhaustion, but also a hint of acceptance in his eyes. Let's go, she said. Chapter 18. The Lioness in Winter. The journey to Marco's sanctuary was long and arduous. They traveled mostly at night, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the shadows, their bodies weary, their spirits tested. Raphael led the way, his knowledge of the countryside, his experience in evading pursuit, proving invaluable. He was a different man now, subdued, remorseful, his arrogance replaced by a quiet determination to protect Livia and Marco, to atone for his past sins. Livia watched him, her feelings a tangled mess of mistrust, resentment, and a lingering, unwanted attraction. She couldn't deny the spark that still flickered between them, the magnetic pull that had drawn her to him in the first place. But she couldn't forget his betrayal, his deception, the pain he had caused her. They communicated mostly in silence, their conversations brief and functional, focused on the practicalities of survival. The emotional chasm between them remained vast, a gaping wound that refused to heal. Marco, recovering slowly from his injuries, was the bridge between them, the one who tried to mediate, to ease the tension, to foster some semblance of unity. He had forgiven Raphael, or at least, he had accepted his change of heart, his willingness to help them. He saw the good in him, the potential for redemption. He's trying, Livia, Marco said to her one evening as they rested in a small, abandoned farmhouse. He's risking his life for us. You have to give him that. Livia sighed, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the small fire they had built in the hearth. I know, she said, her voice weary. But it's hard. It's hard to trust him, after everything. Trust is earned, Marco said, his voice gentle. And he's trying to earn it back. Give him a chance. Livia didn't reply. She knew Marco was right, but her heart was still guarded, her emotions raw. She needed time, space, to process everything that had happened, to decide if she could ever truly forgive Raphael, if she could ever truly trust him again. After several days of travel, they finally reached their destination. It was a small, isolated cottage, nestled in a remote valley, surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. It was a simple place, rustic and unassuming, but it felt like a haven, a sanctuary from the dangers and betrayals of the world they had left behind. The cottage belonged to an old woman, a distant relative of their father's, a woman who had lived a solitary life, far from the intrigues and violence of the mafia world. She welcomed them with open arms, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. I knew your father well, she said, her voice raspy with age. He was a good man, despite his flaws. He would be glad to know you are safe here. Her name was Emilia, and she was a woman of quiet strength and resilience, a woman who had endured her own share of hardship and loss. She reminded Livia of her own mother, of the strength and grace that had characterized the women of the Marchesi family. Emilia provided them with food, shelter, and a much-needed sense of security. She tended to Marco's wounds, her hands skilled and gentle. She listened to their story, her eyes filled with compassion and wisdom. The past is the past, she said, her voice firm. You cannot change what has happened, but you can choose how you live your future. You can choose to be defined by your pain, or you can choose to rise above it. Her words resonated with Livia, a gentle reminder that she had a choice, that she was not a victim, that she had the power to shape her own destiny. She spent her days helping Emilia with chores, tending to the small garden, gathering wood for the fire, finding a solace in the simple rhythms of rural life. It was a world away from the opulent mansions and the dangerous streets of the city, a world where she could breathe freely, where she could begin to heal. She still hadn't forgiven Raphael. She still didn't trust him. But she was starting to see him in a new light, not as a monster, not as a betrayer, but as a flawed, damaged human being, capable of both great cruelty and great kindness. Like a lioness in winter, her strength was still present, dormant but potent. And one quiet evening, sitting by the fire, Emilia handed her something. A small, worn, leather-bound book. Your father left this for you, Emilia said. Chapter 19. Scars that bind, scars that break. The leather-bound book felt heavy in Livia's hands, the worn leather smooth and cool against her skin. It was old, the edges frayed, the pages yellowed with age. She recognized her father's handwriting on the cover, a single word inscribed in elegant script. Livia. She sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cottage. Marco and Raphael were asleep in another room, exhausted from their journey, their bodies and minds finally finding some respite. Emilia sat across from her, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding, a silent encouragement. Livia opened the book, her heart pounding in her chest. She began to read, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting, her mind transported back to her childhood, to the days when her father had been her hero, her protector, her guide. The book was a journal, a collection of her father's thoughts, his reflections, his confessions. He wrote of his love for his family, his pride in his children, his hopes for their future. He wrote of his struggles, his doubts, his fears. He wrote of the burdens of leadership, the weight of responsibility, the constant pressure of maintaining power in a world of violence and betrayal. He wrote of his mistakes, his regrets, his sins. He wrote of the choices he had made, the compromises he had been forced to accept, the blood that had been spilled. He wrote of his growing disillusionment with the mafia world, his desire to escape its clutches, to protect his children from its corrupting influence. And he wrote of Raphael. He wrote of his admiration for the young man's intelligence, his ambition, his loyalty. He wrote of how he had taken Raphael under his wing, groomed him as his successor, entrusted him with his most closely guarded secrets. But he also wrote of his growing unease, his suspicion that Raphael's loyalty was not what it seemed. He wrote of the whispers he had heard, the rumors of Raphael's past, his connection to a rival family, his vow of vengeance. He wrote of his fear that he had made a terrible mistake, that he had brought a serpent into his home, a wolf into his fold. He wrote of his plan to expose Raphael, to remove him from power, to protect his family from his treachery. But he had been too late. Livia read the final entry, her hands trembling, tears streaming down her face. Her father had known. He had known about Raphael's betrayal, about his plan to destroy the Marchesi family. And he had been powerless to stop it. The journal was a revelation, a confirmation of Marco's story, a glimpse into the heart and mind of a man who had been both a loving father and a ruthless leader. It was a testament to the complexities of human nature, the capacity for both great good and great evil. Livia closed the book, her heart heavy with grief and understanding. She understood now, finally, the full extent of Raphael's betrayal, the depth of his deception. But she also understood her father's flaws, his mistakes, his complicity in his own downfall. She looked up at Emilia, her eyes filled with tears. "He knew," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "He knew about Raphael." Emilia nodded, her expression sad but resolute. "He did," she said. "And he tried to protect you in his own way." Livia held the journal close to her chest, a tangible link to her father, a reminder of his love, his legacy. It was a burden, a responsibility, but it was also a source of strength, a guide to help her navigate the treacherous path ahead. The scars of the past, the wounds of betrayal, they would always be there. But they could also be a source of power, a catalyst for change. They could bind her to her family, to her heritage, to her destiny. Or they could break her, consume her, destroy her. The choice was hers. She looked towards the room where Raphael slept. She still didn't know if she could ever forgive him. But she knew, with a growing certainty, that she could no longer deny the truth. Her father's final words in the diary were, "Find the Falcone ledger. It holds the key." Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The Falcone ledger, Livia said, the words a whisper in the quiet of the cottage. "What is it?" Emilia looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "It's a record," she said, her voice low. "A detailed account of your father's dealings. Business transactions, alliances, betrayals, everything." "And why is it so important?" Livia asked, her heart pounding. "Because it contains information," Emilia replied, "information that could destroy many powerful families. Information that could expose secrets, reveal crimes, bring down empires." "And Raphael, does he know about it?" Emilia nodded. "He does. And he wants it. He believes it will give him the power he craves, the leverage he needs to control the families, to avenge his father's death." Livia understood now. The ledger was the key, the ultimate prize in the deadly game they were playing. It was the reason Raphael had infiltrated the Marchesi family, the reason he had betrayed her father, the reason he was still pursuing them. "Where is it?" Livia asked, her voice urgent. Emilia hesitated, her eyes searching Livia's. "It's hidden," she said. "Your father hid it well. Only he knew the exact location. But he left clues. In the journal." Livia grabbed the journal, her hands trembling. She flipped through the pages, scanning her father's handwriting, searching for any hint, any clue that could lead her to the ledger. She found it. A series of cryptic phrases, hidden within seemingly innocuous entries, references to places, people, events that only she and Marco would understand. It was a code, a secret language that her father had created to protect the ledger from falling into the wrong hands. With Marco's help, they deciphered the code, piecing together the fragments of information, unraveling the mystery. The clues led them to a location, a place they both remembered from their childhood, the Marchesi family's old villa on the coast, the place where they had spent their summers, the place where their mother had died. It was a dangerous journey, a risky gamble. The villa was likely under surveillance, watched by Salieri's men, perhaps even by Raphael himself. But they had no choice. They had to retrieve the ledger before Raphael could find it, before he could use it to unleash chaos and destruction. They set off the next morning, leaving Emilia behind in the safety of the cottage. Raphael insisted on accompanying them, his presence a constant reminder of his betrayal, but also a source of protection, his skills and knowledge invaluable in their perilous quest. The journey was tense, fraught with danger. They avoided the main roads, sticking to the back roads, traveling mostly at night, their senses on high alert. They finally reached the villa, its once grand facade now faded and crumbling, a symbol of the Marchesi family's fallen glory. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, the silence broken only by the crashing of the waves against the shore. They searched the villa, following the clues her father had left, their hearts pounding with anticipation and fear. They found secret passages, hidden compartments, forgotten rooms. But the ledger was nowhere to be found. Finally, they reached their mother's old study, a room filled with books, paintings, and memories. Livia remembered spending hours in this room as a child, listening to her mother read stories, watching her paint, feeling safe and loved. And there, hidden behind a portrait of their mother, they found it, a small, unassuming wooden box, locked with a complex mechanism. Marco, using his skills with mechanics, managed to open the box. Inside, they found the Falcone Ledger, a thick, leather-bound volume filled with names, dates, transactions, secrets. As Livia held the ledger in her hands, she felt the weight of its power, the potential for both good and evil that it contained. It was a weapon, a tool, a key to unlocking the past and shaping the future. Suddenly, they heard a noise.
Footsteps, approaching fast.
They were not alone. Raphael drew his gun, his body tensing, his eyes scanning the room. "Get behind me," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. The door burst open, and a figure stepped into the room. It was Salieri, his face contorted with rage, his eyes blazing with a murderous light. He was holding a gun, his aim steady, his finger on the trigger. "So," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "the prodigal daughter returns. And with the traitor, Costa. How fitting." The final confrontation had begun. A confrontation of hearts, of loyalties, of past sins and present dangers. A confrontation that would determine the fate of the Marchesi family, the fate of Raphael, and the fate of Livia herself. She stepped forward. "It's over, Salieri." Epilogue. Livia stepped forward, her voice ringing with a newfound authority, a strength forged in the crucible of betrayal and loss. "It's over, Salieri," she repeated, her gaze unwavering, her eyes fixed on the man who had orchestrated the destruction of her family. Salieri chuckled, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed in the stillness of the room. "Over?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's only just begun, Principessa. You have something I want, and I always get what I want." He gestured towards the ledger, his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. "The Falcone Ledger," he said. "Hand it over, and I might consider sparing your lives." Livia held the ledger tightly, her knuckles white. "This ledger will never fall into your hands," she said, her voice firm. "It's going to the authorities. Your reign of terror is over." Salieri's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "You dare defy me?" he snarled. "You, a mere girl, a ruined heiress? You have no power, no leverage." "I have the truth," Livia said, her voice rising. "And the truth is more powerful than any weapon, any threat, any army." She turned to Raphael, her eyes meeting his. He stood beside her, his gun still drawn, his body tense, ready to defend her, ready to fight for her. It was a strange alliance, a fragile truce, born of necessity and a shared desire for justice. Raphael, Livia said, her voice clear and steady. Take Marco and get out of here. Get the ledger to safety. I'll hold him off. Raphael hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He knew the danger, the risk she was taking. But he also saw the determination in her eyes, the fire that burned within her. He knew he couldn't dissuade her, couldn't stop her from facing her destiny. Livia, he began, but she cut him off. Go, she said, her voice firm. This is my fight. This is my family's legacy. I won't let him win. Raphael nodded, his expression a mixture of admiration and regret. He knew she was right. This was her battle, her moment of truth. He grabbed Marco's arm, urging him towards the door. Marco resisted, his eyes filled with concern for his sister.
Livia, no.
He protested. We can't leave you. You have to, Livia said, her voice urgent. You have to protect the ledger. It's the only way to stop him, to stop them all. Marco, reluctantly, allowed Raphael to pull him away. They disappeared through the doorway, their footsteps fading into the distance. Livia turned back to Salieri, her heart pounding in her chest. She was alone, facing a man who had nothing to lose, a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. It's just you and me now, she said, her voice trembling slightly, but filled with a steely resolve. Salieri raised his gun, his aim steady, his finger on the trigger. Any last words, Principessa? He sneered. Livia took a deep breath, her mind clear, her spirit strong. She had come to terms with her past, with her losses, with her betrayals. She was no longer a frightened girl, a helpless victim. She was a Marchese, a warrior, a survivor. Only this, she said, her voice ringing with defiance. The Marcheses may be fallen, but we are not broken. And we will never surrender. As Salieri pulled the trigger, a shot rang out. But it wasn't Salieri's gun. Raphael stood in the doorway, his own gun smoking, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Salieri crumpled to the floor, the Falcone ledger falling from his lifeless hand. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Livia's ragged breathing and the distant sound of the waves crashing against the shore. Raphael lowered his gun, his body slumping with exhaustion and the weight of his actions. He had killed Salieri, the man who had been both his enemy and his mentor, the man who had shaped his life, his destiny. He looked at Livia, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions, gratitude, regret, and a love that he knew could never be fully realized, never be fully accepted. It's over, he said, his voice hoarse. Livia nodded, her own eyes filled with tears. It's over, she repeated. The scars remained, the wounds of betrayal and loss still raw. But a new chapter had begun, a chapter of healing, of rebuilding, of forging a new path, a new legacy. Livia, no longer a ruined heiress, but a woman of strength, courage, and resilience, stood ready to face the future, whatever it may hold. The ledger was safe. Marco would see it delivered. She looked at Raphael.
Go, she said.
He hesitated, then nodded. He turned and left. This time for good. Livia picked up the ledger. It was time. The end.